ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's Policy Matters session. I would like to welcome Anju Fujioka and Anne-Lise Bloch. Anju Fujioka is a lawyer and a victims advocate who specializes in representing survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, also known as SGBV. In addition to working as a civil litigator, Anju works as a Canadian SGBV expert for the Ministry of Justice of the Gambia as a part of Global Affairs STAP EDM program implemented by Alinea International. Anju also co-founded and supervises Legal Information for Sexual Assault, also known as LISA, program at the Western University, which provides free legal information related to sexual assault to current Western students. Anju is also dedicated to public legal education and advocacy and also works as a guest lecturer and volunteers pro bono for leading universities and organizations. Anju serves at the board vice chair of ANOVA, Ontario's largest sexual assault center and shelter, and a board member of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF. She's a global citizen who has lived in several continents and speaks English, French, and Japanese. She applies her lived experience to represent diverse and often marginalized groups. Anne-Lise Bloch is a knowledge-sharing officer at the International Development Research Center, where she supports the Democratic and Inclusive Governance Program in delivering research and policy innovations to enable greater inclusion, accountability, and transparency by institutions and states across the developing world. Previously, Anne-Lise also worked as a consultant and legal researcher specializing in international human rights, law, corporate accountability, and climate change under international law, both in Canada and internationally. Her experience reflects her passion for the promotion of sustainable development at a just transition ensuring that climate and environmental policies are designed in an inclusive, participatory, and human rights compliant manner. She holds a master's in international law from the Geneva Graduate Institute, Switzerland, and a Juris Doctor from University of Ottawa. We welcome you and really excited to have you today. With that, I pass it on to Biko to moderate today's session.
Thank you, Sagariko. I'll just start off by saying, Rachel, congratulations! Like you killed it during the during the during the Jeopardy. So I just wanted to give you a little shout out there. And I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session. Today I'll be a moderator. My name is Biko. I'm a senior communications officer with CanWatch, and I'm excited to be here with all of you today. We'll be diving into a crucial aspect of Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, its Action Area 5 on inclusive governance. We have the privilege of having Anju and Anne-Lise with us today, and with that, we'll go right in. For my first question to both of you, could you tell us briefly about your respective organizations and how your work is broadly related to FIAP? We'll start off with you, Anju, and then Anne-Lise.
Hi, and hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. And I want to first thank the OCIC for inviting me to speak on behalf of Alinea. We'll talk about it a lot today, but the work that you're doing and individual organizations within the OCIC and what Alinea is doing through its work is really aligned. So it's great to have this opportunity to connect and collaborate. Now, before I kind of tell you a little bit about the organization and how we work on the FIAP, I do want to note that I'm joining from London, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and the Dwandran peoples. And in the spirit of kind of at least meaningfully engaging with kind of this land acknowledgement as well, I think it's important to mention that when we're talking about inclusive governance, and when we're talking about, what does it look like to take a feminist lens to that or an inclusive lens, I think the natural, what follows from there is how do we make it less colonial or decolonize it? And even in Canada, we're living alongside Indigenous communities and nations that have been self-governing long before settlers arrived, had their own models of governance that still continue. And there was a lot of, colonial governance structures that were imposed on them and are causing ongoing harm. So as we start delving into that issue, it's also something perhaps maybe we won't cover it in any deep or meaningful way today, but I'd like to at least put that out there so it's something you engage with. Now, in terms of Alinea, the company that I'm here representing, it's one that was established about 40 years ago, so 1986. And so it's kind of that middle-aged company in the sector of international development. And its mission really is to support the UN SDGs by providing technical and management expertise to governments, companies, communities. So they have consultancies based in Canada. That really was its originating point. And then since then also have consultancies in Australia, Europe, and the UK. And each one of those, let's say, markets manages its own range of projects. So a company and its kind of the markets have worked in multiple sectors, so they can range from agriculture, education, governance, and that's kind of really where we're at today, peace and security, legal and judicial reform, health and gender equity, equality, environment, climate change, economic growth. So really, if you think about the SDGs, all of those elements there, we've worked on some kind of project related to them. Typically, the company's clients are national governments. So in Canada, typically our client is Global Affairs Canada. And we've also designed and implemented and managed, monitored, evaluated projects for other clients, for example, the Asian Development Bank or the UN, to name a couple. So, but most of the time it is national government entities that the organization works for or has contracts with. Now, where I fit in and where a lot of what I'll talk about today will be focused on is a relatively new project of Alinea, or that Alinea is implementing, called the TAP EDM, or Technical Assistance Partnership Expert Deployment Mechanism. A huge mouthful, so I'll just call it the TAP for the most part. It's a newer project, about 3 years in, and the aim is to deliver short-term technical assistance. So that's maybe projects from about 12 months to 18 months, responding to the express needs of national government entities. So what that really, all that means is for assistance eligible entities, yes, there we go. It's in the links that you can see some of the projects, but for national governments and the ministries, when they reach out and say there is a certain area where they would like Canadian expertise or technical expertise, that's when we work with Global Affairs, and Alinea identifies those experts within Canada and then has them deliver short-term projects. So the TAP EDM initiative really stemmed from consular relationships that Canada had. There are many, so that was kind of the originating point. And they're usually looking for highly specialized organizations and individuals to deliver on very specific things. So for example, I'll be talking about this later, but my initiative, and the one that I'm a Canadian expert on, is working with the Ministry of Justice in the Gambia, specifically around sexual and gender-based violence. And so that was the kind of expertise that they were looking for. And then Alinea goes out, finds someone like me in Canada, and then, has me work on that project. So the main objective, I guess, how the FIAP ties into this, is that the main objective of this TAP EDM initiative is to promote FIAP through technical assistance. So it doesn't get more closely connected than that. And like I said, a lot of these initiatives are very much focused around gender equality at its core. But then also 25%, for example, of these TAP projects are specifically related to inclusive governance. So, and taking a step back, we've had about 80 Canadian experts. At least that's a language that's just used. It's not because I love calling myself an expert, but we've had over 80 Canadian experts deployed to over 30 countries we just within that TAP programming itself. And we typically, our kind of connection point is the Canadian diplomatic, the embassies there, or the high commissions, since we don't necessarily have an in-country representative, at least from Alinea's side. So a little bit of a big picture overview of what the company is. If it's still confusing, ask questions, I think, or down the line, you can also take a look at the website where it's kind of laid out as well. Either way, I'll hand it over to Anne-Lise now to talk a little bit about her organization and who she is.
Thanks, Anju. So, and I'd like to echo your comments thanking the OCIC for inviting us both to speak today. It's really exciting. You also preempted, I was going to note, I am calling in today from the Ottawa area, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I just wanted to take the time to acknowledge that the Anishinaabe, the Algonquin peoples, have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I'm very grateful to be able to call this my home and to be able to, have the opportunity to speak to you all from here. So a little bit about my organization. I work for the International Development Research Centre, the IDRC for short. We are a part of Canada's foreign affairs and development efforts, but we're not fully associated with the implementation of the FIAP because we are a Crown corporation. So we were established by an act of parliament in the 1970s. And what we do is we invest in high quality research in developing countries that directly supports and enables research to be done by researchers in those countries. And in so doing, the center is really keen to share the knowledge that's generated from this research that we've invested in, both with other researchers, policymakers, and also the private sector, and to mobilize a network of alliances in helping us to move the needle on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. To help achieve its vision for a more inclusive and sustainable world, the center works across 5 different program areas. So this includes fostering climate resilient food systems. We have a global health program, which works for the promotion of adequate health care. We have a program that focuses on the delivery of high quality education and science. We have a program that is looking at sustainable and inclusive economies. We also have, in recent years, developed epidemic preparedness research and responses in developing countries. And the last program is the program that I'm from, which is the Democratic and Inclusive Governance Program. So within that team, we basically work to support data, research evidence, and policy innovation to enable greater inclusion, accountability, and transparency by institutions, by states, and by non-state actors alike. So in practice, what this looks like is a lot of research investments across a broad spectrum spanning human rights. We have a number of projects related to forced displacement, as well as some projects that are related specifically to the maintenance of a free and open online civic space. And tangentially connected to that as well, we have a number of projects looking at tech-facilitated gender-based violence. But most of these projects are viewed through the lens, again, of inclusive governance and sort of human rights promotion. I'll stop there before I could go on for quite a long time, but I just wanted to finish by maybe noting very briefly that, broadly speaking, our work is, within my team, but also within the IDRC, is very much reflected in the work that is outlined in Canada's FIAP, but we do not actually work for that specific promotion. So we, for the promotion of that specific framework, although there are lots and lots of similarities.
Thank you both for that important context. You've touched on this a little bit, but perhaps it's an opportunity to go into it with a bit more detail, and we can start with you, Anne-Lise. But could we go into a discussion a little bit of the need to focus on inclusive governance more specifically? Why is there a need to stress on it and really put an emphasis on it specifically?
Absolutely. Yeah. So governance, so when we use the word governance at the IDRC, what we're talking about is the way that governments use and exercise their power. And governance in that context has profound impacts on people's lives and on a country's ability to develop sustainably. So we believe that it's important for governance to be inclusive, which both means that anyone can access services and exercise their rights around and freedoms without fear or hindrance. But it also means that it's reflective of the general population, so that there are women who are enabled to be able to participate in governance systems and in decision-making practices, but not just women's, but also marginalized communities, and other sort of, the idea being that the people who are in a decision-making position within a given country reflect the population of that country. We also believe that governance, it's important for it to be transparent and accountable, right? So that means everyone can freely and fearlessly make their views known about decisions that are going to affect them in their lives. And also that they can understand what their governments are doing and why they're doing it. And it's basically the ability to question and hold their governments responsible for decisions and actions. Unfortunately, what we see a lot is that communities around the world are becoming increasingly challenged by decreasing government accountability, by attacks against human rights defenders and human rights in general. We're looking at shrinking civic spaces, a rise in autocratization, lack of justice or an inability to meaningfully access justice for human rights violations, increased discrimination and inequality. And all the while, we're seeing that while dealing with some pretty big existential threats and sustainable development challenges like the climate emergency. So from this perspective, I think it's clear that investing in the promotion and the support of inclusive governance is a key and crucial aspect of Canada's foreign development priority. But I think there's another layer to this too, right? And the FIAP stresses this, and we at IDRC also do, in the sense that we view inclusive governance as being fundamental to long-term sustainable development. So in other words, inclusive, transparent, accountable governance structures are what can make the difference as to whether an initiative is successful or not. In this sense, good governance, by which we mean the rule of law, access to justice, effective and accountable institutions, and participatory and representative decision-making. It's not just crucial to, SDG 16, which looks at peace, justice, and strong institutions, but it's also foundational to achieving all of the economic, social, and environmental peace and security objectives that are outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the same very much can be said for the FIAP, right? Like, inclusive governance is necessary to ensure delivery on action area policies related to gender equality and the empowerment of women. It's important to realize for the realization of the items on human dignity, on sustainable and equitable growth, on environmental and climate action, on peace and security. So I think if we view inclusive governance not just as being reflective of like how we see the positions of power being occupied, but also the processes through which government decisions are made, we understand that in order for those governance decisions that are enacting policies on maybe sustainable and equitable growth or environmental and climate action, if they're not designed in an inclusive, participatory, and accountable way, they will be less likely overall to be sustainable long-term and also to be equitably designed. So, in short, I think it's one thing to have evidence with which we develop equitable and sustainable policies, but we really need good governance structures in order to actually be able to implement those policies in a way that's inclusive, participatory, and accountable. So for me, it's in that sense like both a goal in and of itself. We want to achieve inclusive governance, but it's also a necessary component of delivering on all the other aspects that we're working on when it comes to sustainable development.
I'll ask the same to you, Anju, if you have anything to add or anything to complement that.
Anne-Lise, thanks for such a comprehensive overview. I feel like between that and the initial pieces that we did already before getting into this panel, a lot of it's covered. But maybe there are a couple of things I'd like to highlight, not in any specific order. And the first one is really that emphasis on sustainability. So a key problem, and it's already been said, but key issue with, inclusive governance, or where governance isn't inclusive, is the issue of corruption as well, right? And when you have corruption, and when you have at least the environment that, makes it easy to maintain these corrupt systems, not have inclusive governance, that really also impacts the sustainability of any initiative. So we can go, anyone can go in and implement. It doesn't have to be us coming from Canada. It can even just be the national governments or the CSOs there as well, implementing policies or coming up with ideas. But if you don't have those governance structures, at least like you said, a lot of that becomes obsolete, and then it really is a resource drain. And oftentimes, that's the criticism I think that we see in this sector, international development, is why are we sending all this money? Why are we sending all these resources, all this expertise, only, for the moment we step out, right? Like nothing happens, or it seems like it's all gone to waste. So really, even to ensure the continuity, the sustainability, and even ownership of, whatever international development work we're doing, or international cooperation work we're doing, kind of having that inclusive government, strong governance space is really important. The second thing I wanted to kind of point out is about governance and the barriers to inclusive governance, not just being at the, the government level or individual policymakers level, but really it's important to look at it from a system level. And that's the challenge a lot of the time in this work as well, is to really be able to look at the power dynamics, the structures, the biases, the cultural norms, the expectations, all of these, oftentimes your intangibles, the things that aren't spelled out on paper, the things that you can't quite capture in just a review of policy to improve it, or just talking to the chief decision maker, the person writing, making the decisions, really understanding what are those barriers and what are, that to inclusive participation and input, not just in the creation of these policies and procedures and laws and all of that, but also in, the public's ability to engage with them, to be heard, to be able to provide input, and to hold governments accountable to these, policies and structures that they've created. And then, since I am someone who works very specifically with SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence, and given that this is the FIAP context, I also want to highlight that, inclusive governance is so important to reducing, right? Eliminating would be a great goal, I think, but at least reducing sexual and gender-based violence. Anne-Lise has already touched on kind of those pieces about the focus on human rights. There's been some mention of access to justice as well, and the rule of law. But just to kind of fill that in, it's really important if we're thinking as, gender equality as this kind of overarching theme, the umbrella, the guiding principle as well. Where does good governance fit into that? And it fits in by saying when you have good inclusive governance, sorry, I keep using good governance as from another life, but inclusive, when we are, looking at governance inclusively here, we're focusing on human rights. That means, just the rights of women and girls and children and other really folks who just experience disproportionate levels of violence, and sexual and gender-based violence tends to be one of those key ones. When we can eliminate that, or even, educate women, girls about their rights, help them seek those legal, or create the structures within which they can seek legal redress, and then, or even just train justice sector or, law enforcement to really understand the policies, the structures in place to eliminate sexual and gender-based violence, and then actually implement that in a fair, responsive way. All of those pieces really go a huge way to, the kind of the ultimate goals, right, and the SDGs as well. So that's all part of inclusive governance. It's not just a piece of FIAP Action Area 1. Right? It really is also very integral to Action Area 5. So I think those are a few things that I wanted to highlight, but yeah, over back to you.
Thank you both. I'm just touching right here, taking all the notes I can to absorb everything you're saying. Thank you so much for all the incredible insights and knowledge. I think what's really sticking out to me is the interconnection that inclusive governance has to a lot of different other pieces, and how it's pivotal really to achieving a lot of what we talk about when it comes to inclusive development, gender equality. And I think one of the areas we can probably go into in terms of thinking about Canada's other commitments is how does the commitments within the realm of inclusive governance connect or become related to our international work, to Canada's international work, to Canada's national own commitments. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how those pieces start to become interlinked. And we can start with you, Anju, this time.
Yeah, I feel like in terms of Canada's national and international commitments between, again, kind of discussion, the initial piece with the Jamboard, and then Anne-Lise touching on the SDGs quite heavily, feel like we've covered quite a bit on that. One thing I'll say is, there are national action plans, for example, that Canada has for women, peace, and security. We also allegedly have a feminist kind of foreign policy as well. That's supposed to cover a lot more than just kind of the international development FIAP. So in terms of Action Area 5 and its commitments, and I could probably say this a bit broader with just really the FIAP, all of the action areas to some extent or another, they really, I think there's a bit more cohesion now between Canada's policies generally, like that internal cohesion within Canada's policies, not just as it relates to international development and the policies and priorities of the FIAP specifically. So not sure if that makes all that much sense, but it's one comment. Maybe Anne-Lise has some more insights.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I definitely have already mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think they do bear repeating in this context. We saw earlier, like a lot of the actual performance indicators that were identified under Action Area 5 are actually, linked to Sustainable Development Goal 16. I think it was the number of individuals with enforced capacity to deliver justice or legal services. That's lifted from a performance indicator for the UN Sustainable Development Goal 16.3. So I think that when we're talking in general about inclusive governance, I think you can very much draw parallels to that. But what I think is interesting is sort of picking up a little bit on what you said afterwards, Anju, this idea that there's domestic, when we're looking at sustainable development goals, there's the domestic component. But there's also, it's this idea of a development for the world, right? And I think that that's also very much mirrored if we look at Canada's human rights obligations, which I do think are also related, are a related commitment in this context. Notably, those related to civic spaces, so freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, or those that are related to participation. So the right to participate in public and political life is a widely recognized human right. The right to access justice, which is both a human right in and of itself and is also recognized as a key component of the overall framework for the protection and promotion of human rights, both domestically, but then again, more broadly, right? So I think that the way that the FIAP is designed, and specifically the way that the action area that discusses inclusive governance is presented, I think it really does draw on a lot of these commitments, even if they're not explicitly stated. And I think, yeah, you could also draw to other human rights treaties. We've discussed CEDAW today, but you could also draw to the treaties on the rights of people with disabilities, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I could go on, but suffice to say, I think we have a lot of both international and national commitments that reflect both domestically and internationally the need to promote inclusive governance.
Thank you both. Just kind of dovetailing off of that, I'm wondering, Anne-Lise, if you have any initiatives or projects that come to mind when we talk about inclusive governance. Is there anything that specifically speaks out to you in terms of an initiative or something that's particularly working on inclusive governance?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, I'm with the team at IDRC that does democratic and inclusive governance. So I won't go through and list all of our projects because They're all related, but I think that would be a bit of a waste of time. You can easily access them on our website if you're interested, but there's a couple of initiatives that I'd like to talk about because I think they're very interesting for sort of the discussion that we've had up until this point. The first one is that we've, for a number of years, I think beginning in 2016, have supported grassroots access to justice and legal empowerment initiatives and research. So this basically stemmed from initial research that came out around that time that suggested that the vast majority of people around the world that are facing some kind of legal problems, that means like a problem that has legal aspects or raises legal issues, or even that might have consequences shaped by law, never actually interact in any way, shape, or form with a lawyer, with a courthouse, or with a formal justice institution. And when we put that finding in the context of realizing that meaningful access to justice is not a reality for some 5.1, billion people around the world, then we start to recognize that in addressing the need to promote access to justice for disenfranchised and marginalized communities, we have to, and this is me as someone who's trained in 2 degrees in law, we have to find solutions that look sort of beyond the very specific spheres of you need a lawyer, you're going to a courthouse, you get a judgment, because it's just not a feasible reality, but it also shows that it's not the way that most people around the world, and including in Canada, are maybe dealing with all of their legal problems. So recognizing this, we initiated a number of projects, a group of projects. We call them cohorts. So if I call it a cohort, that's the context. That was looking at shifting towards a more people-centered approach, which would look at how do we meet people with these legal problems where they are and deliver legal services, but in a way that they're actually going to be able to use. And so legal empowerment broadly refers to one such approach. And it's really, the focus there is all on increasing the ability of individuals to know, to use, and then to shape the law. And a lot of those projects that we've had, for instance, one was in Nigeria and Lagos, looked at enabling community-trained paralegals to provide not necessarily legal advice in the way that we might conceive of it in the Canadian context, but to be able to be embedded within local communities that were in informal settlements in and around Lagos in Nigeria, who had never and had no hope of actually being able to access a lawyer or someone who had through a licensing process become accredited, but still nevertheless had legal problems that they wanted to be able to speak to someone about, because in certain instances you might do a cost benefit analysis and realize that certain services are maybe not worth it based on the specific dispute at hand. But in some cases, it's also about not knowing what rights you have in that context. And so community paralegals were trained up under that initiative, and we've done a number of other projects that look at how we can improve legal empowerment in that context, all with the goal of, again, basically trying to fill an access to justice gap by actually taking a people-centered approach, and by suggesting that we need both the lawyers and the courthouses and all these formal justice institutions, but also people who are going to be accessible, and so the individuals can actually know what the law is, know what their rights are in this context, know how to engage with that, how to exercise their rights, and then also know how they can be involved in the shaping of those policies that are affecting their lives. So that's a really interesting area that I think we at Democratic and Inclusive Governance have been working on for a number of years. And we have a learning cohort with projects from all around the world that convenes across different thematic areas. So we have groups that are working on access to justice in environmental issues and land issues, but also some that are working on access to justice in terms of women's empowerment, in terms of the informal economy. And we bring them together, and it's not just this idea of capacity building and workshops, but also this idea of like solidarity across different issue areas, if you will, but also across the globe, that looks at what works and what doesn't work when we're looking at these more like nebulous and less formal processes. We've also, another project I'll quickly note before I turn it over to Anju, I'm mindful that I've been speaking for a while, but is a project that we're with the American Bar Association, the American Bar Foundation, where we're actually helping to streamline how we collect data around SDG 16.3, because it's not easy how you measure improvements in access to justice. And in fact, a lot of countries, when they're measuring sort of their performance with regards to specific indicators, really struggled with coming up with an indicator for measuring 16.3. So this one is looking at how different countries in the world are doing it, how we can streamline it, and then how from that we can then start to build up a policy, you know, from an evidence base where we're looking at the implementation of 16.3 across the world. And then maybe very quickly, more recently, we've just invested in 2 groups of projects related to governance dimensions of the climate emergency. One is looking at human rights defenders. So we've got groups, research projects around the world that's looking at how to promote and protect human rights defenders who are working in the climate and environmental space, because they face the highest risk of violent reprisal for their work of all the human rights defenders in the world, and particularly if they're Indigenous or they're from rural communities. So we're looking at identifying different strategies to help support them in their work as they start to engage with exercising, you know, their right to participate in public decision-making, their right to freedom of expression, their right to defend human rights, which is in and of itself a human right. And then the other group of projects is looking at the governance dimensions of forced displacement in the context of the climate emergency. And I can talk a bit about that later, but those are just some of the initiatives. So you can see it's a wide net that we cast, but there is always this governance thread that sort of is how we group all of our projects under one umbrella. Maybe I'll pass it over to Anju.
And that's awesome, fascinating stuff. And I could be listening forever, but I'll talk about a few projects. So one I can talk about is one implemented by Alinea, the bigger organization that's not part of the TAP EDM project. And that one is around Ukraine. I'll also chat briefly about just give some examples of, you know, the inclusive governance focus initiatives that we have, just to kind of give you a sense of the spectrum or the types of initiatives that we might be involved in. And then, because I love talking about it, I'll also briefly touch on the initiative that I was involved with the Ministry of Justice, not too unlike a little bit what Anne-Lise had already talked about, but, you know, different in its own way. So on the Ukraine piece, so that one, Alinea was supporting or continues to support Ukraine's Reform for Governance project. So it's called SURGE project, and it's supporting the government of Ukraine in a variety of areas to deliver governance, economic reforms, and that are intended to better respond to the needs of its citizens, but especially women and girls, again, you know, all really guided by the FIAP. So this is another global affairs project, just not part of the TAP EDM subsection or the sub-project. And this one's building up already on other initiatives as Canada's had in the country. But so it really does focus on management, you know, being able to measure things like Anne-Lise said, that is a big challenge throughout the sector, but really being able to measure what those needs are, then, you know, introducing and supporting the integration of these needs that were identified into planning processes as they, you know, especially now after the war, as they rebuild, really looking at, you know, various ministries, their needs and the support. They've provided support to the justice sector, training police officers in more gender inclusive ways, especially, or in terms of humanitarian responses. They're working with specifically the ministry that's in charge of rebuilding as well, to really look at post, you know, once the conflict is over, how does that work happen? How do you create inclusive governance structures? And clearly they would, you know, that would also involve a discussion, not just of the financial elements, not just of, you know, how ministries are organized, but also the issues of corruption, right? Like things like that. So it's really a very big project aimed at kind of supporting not a whole of government approach at all in any sense, but really various aspects within the government there. So when one of the important things there is throughout this, they're really they're using or applying the GBA plus, so gender-based analysis plus model. I think that's something that you may have covered in your prior discussions about the FIAP. But in a nutshell, it's really just an approach used by the Canadian government to really think about the differential impacts that policies or, can have on different people, so on women or on more marginalized folks, and really taking that intersectional approach and when evaluating, creating, and monitoring different interventions. So that's one of the projects that's currently ongoing. Another, I said I'd kind of go through a few other examples, and there would, some examples would include advancing inclusive public participation in social impact assessments in Argentina. So that's one of several, slightly resource oriented projects. And on that note, I'll say when we're talking about inclusive governance, especially in resource-rich countries, it's a really important thing, since when there is natural wealth, ensuring inclusive governance, decreasing corruption, and really creating those accountability mechanisms is important, so that all of that wealth is, first of all, managed in a sustainable way, but also that the benefits from that are flowing not just to a certain top echelon of people or a smaller group of people, but that it is being distributed, or it is going down to the people who need it most. And that goes in hand sometimes with, say, tax reform as well, right? There are projects that work in that area where you're looking at, instead of just taxing goods and services, can we tax, income, or how we thinking about these frameworks so that they're benefiting, again, not just the richest, but, or at least so that they're not having disproportionately negative or burdensome impact on the poor and marginalized folks in the country. So when we're looking at various resource-based or projects that have to do with policies surrounding natural resources, that's oftentimes a consideration. So there are a bunch of projects like that. Maybe I just won't list all of them off, and they're on the website. But they, a lot of them have gender equality, inclusive governance as their core pieces. Now, to my project, or the one that I'm currently working on with the Ministry of Justice, the ask came from specifically the Ministry of Justice, but their sexual and gender-based violence unit. And so they had asked for support with an increase in capacity to prosecute sexual and gender-based violence offenses, to prosecute and investigate. And not just in terms of techniques, say, prosecutorial skills, investigative skills, but really to kind of take a look at the mandate is huge of the unit, and I'm surprised they're able to do it with such limited resources. But it's, to really look at the system. How can we support survivors going through engaging with the criminal legal system? What are those barriers affecting us? Because there's a huge social, religious, cultural element to it as well. They're also coming off the heels of 20 years of a dictatorship, which also has its own effect as well. So looking at, how could we make this system more trauma-informed, more survivor victim centric was the big mandate that they had. A lot of our work has really focused not just on a needs kind of assessment or consultation, but specifically on trauma-informed approaches to interviewing victims and witnesses. You can't do it all in a short-term technical assistance initiative. And like I said, even mine has gone a bit longer than it was intended to be, I think. But in that time, we've really been able to work with social workers, not just police, council, but also judges. They're really important because they're the ones making those decisions as well. So really taking, who are these actors? Prison officials, so really taking a look at the various people, the various stakeholders involved in creating a system, and kind of bringing them together to discuss, to communicate with each other about the challenges, but then also to start bringing in some better practices based on, what they're already doing. So a key kind of takeaway from that, it's really hard to measure attitude change. It's also really hard to measure change in skills. And that's also something that definitely doesn't happen overnight. But even between the first and the second time I was there to deliver similar training to different groups, there was some overlap between participants. And there is that little incremental I wouldn't say incremental at all, but there is that change that you'll see sometimes in the way they're framing issues or the way they're approaching, not just interviewing people, but the way they're, sometimes there'll be a way the investigator would think of a question and say, oh, actually, maybe that's based on stereotypes, isn't it? How would you approach this? So, that's the kind of work that we've been able to do with the ministry, at least, is really focus heavily on that underlying stereotypes, biases as well, that give rise to, perhaps inadequate or just maybe not the best kind of interviewing skills, and then working on them in a in their cultural context, in their local context, to see, what is possible, what isn't possible, and how do we make center the victims. So yeah, just some examples of inclusive governance projects, but back to you, since I'm sure I've spoken a lot.
No, I could listen to the both of you all evening. And I have a follow-up question, if we can keep it a little bit short, Anju, just out of curiosity. Does your nature of your organization being consultancy based or as a private entity change the way you approach inclusive governance in either way? Does it does it change your approach to it?
I'll give you the nutshell approach. I think the answer is no. A lot of the times, all of us are used to seeing, the nonprofit, non-governmental CSOs in this space doing a lot of the work. And honestly, that's also what I was used to. And that's, I think most of my colleagues, even at Alinea, that's kind of the spaces that they've been in before. So I think it's a lot more made up in our heads than I think the reality. One difference I might say is that, compare just by nature of the way we contract, a lot of our clients are those national governments. Sometimes that's a different relationship than, other CSOs might have. Again, if GAC is funding your project, your initiatives, maybe that is ultimately something similar, but a lot of our clients are national governments. I think so that creates a dynamic. But other than that, the approaches that we're using, like, a heavy emphasis on localization, making sure that we're looking at results, making sure that having measurable, demonstrable impacts, because I think that was one of the criticisms, right, initially of global affairs and its work, I think a couple of years ago, was that how we're not seeing those results, or we're not being able to measure those results and demonstrate those results. Really, that emphasis on being able to demonstrate results, and having that collaborative approach instead of this dictatorial, the white savior, global north swooping right in, that the lack of that approach. I think those are all best practices that we're seeing, regardless of whether or not you're a consultancy like ours or a CSO. The last point I'll say on this is, when we say private sector, a lot of times I think we think about corporations as well, not necessarily the type that a consultancy is, but more, big businesses, fashion industry, all of that. And the point I'll highlight there is that, including them is also a huge piece in sustainable development as well. So I think Canada's recognized that it's part of the FIAP, their inclusion. But when we're thinking about private and what does that mean, their inclusion is also a really important thing in the big picture.
Thank you. We'll dive into the last question. So if anyone in the audience has a question of your own, start thinking and brainstorming and adding it into the chat or preparing to come off mic in a little bit. This one touches on a little bit of a bit of what you've spoken of so far when it comes to sometimes the issue that comes with corruption, sometimes the issue that comes with dealing in resource-rich settings that sometimes distribute wealth unevenly, and even to the issues we've spoken about on how challenging it can be sometimes to measure things when they vary so differently depending on their context. And so what I'm wondering is, what are some of the challenges? Again, yeah, I know you've both spoken on it a little bit, but are there any that come specifically to this action area when we speak about challenges that you're facing, especially recognizing that there are multiple partners that are often involved? And we can start with Anne-Lise for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We have touched on a couple, and I think one of those is measuring. How do we measure when it's something like access to justice? How do we measure when it's something like inclusive governance, that can become very difficult. And it becomes, I think, a larger issue, which is a key challenge, which is the idea of scaling, right? So within the IDRC, we invest in these very localized projects, and usually they're only looking at one country. Sometimes they're doing a comparative study across 3 countries within the same region. So the results that we get from that research, where we're looking at how do we promote inclusive governance in a very specific context, it's very localized and very applicable to, say, the country in which we initially did that research. But the lack of having standardized and consistent measurement indicators for things like, say, legal empowerment, because there are a lot of different legal empowerment initiatives across the world, the lack of a consistent framework for measuring what works and what doesn't work means that it's very hard to scale up the findings of our research and make it and see what pieces are actually transferable and implementable in countries where we haven't necessarily funded a specific project looking at, say, legal empowerment initiatives in 2 cities within that country. We just don't have the funds to go around the entire world and basically invest in a project that looks at the very specific contexts. So one challenge we have is sort of teasing out the pieces that are applicable across the board, or applicable maybe across a region, because across the board, again, debatable when it comes to the issue of inclusive governance. I think there's a lot of different contexts that play into whether governance can be successful and inclusive in a given society, in a given country. I think Anju definitely already mentioned this, but power dynamics and inequalities within the different actors in this field can also be quite difficult. And I think in our context, because we're investing in research that looks at inclusive governance, we have to be quite careful when we're then turning around and trying to pitch it to the governments, who will be the ones ultimately to implement the policy recommendations that we've developed through our research, because we're basically pitching to the actors who are currently within that governance system and saying, your system, which clearly works for you because this is where you're currently at, doesn't work for the vast majority of your people. So the messaging there becomes a bit difficult. And I think specifically as a Crown corporation, because we are associated with the federal government, even though we are also independent, there's a sense at which we have to be quite careful in approaching how we promote our policy recommendations on inclusive governance in that area, just so that it, again, doesn't sort of mirror that unequal power dynamic of a big, large Western democracy coming into a country and basically eliminating all the context and saying, this is what works for us, and here's how you should structure your government, or here's how you should structure your justice system. That's not like a feasible plan to sort of get policies enacted. So yeah, those are the ones that immediately jump to mind, but I think we've touched on a number throughout this conversation.
Sure, I can jump into a couple. Picking up on where Anne-Lise left off, I think in order to have that buy-in and also to be able to, not have that resistance, or at least reduce that resistance that you might get when you're trying to work on policies with the body that's going to be implementing and co-creating it with you. It's creating that sense of ownership, right? That's really important. And I think the initiatives that are successful are the ones where you're able to get the partners you're working with in from the beginning, from the planning stages, where you come up and you agree on the goals and the why. You have that buy-in throughout, rather than, we have an idea, here, go run with it and we'll see the final product. It's really establishing those relationships. I know the question was, what are the challenges? But if we're kind of flipping that a little bit, being able to establish those relationships with the folks you're working with, be it at the, the governmental level, or it can be with other CSOs, wherever you lie. I think that's really critical to be able to soften that and really make them feel like it's their own. Now, the other thing here is, making it less foreign. So it's important as well that we're not imposing our language and our worldviews either. Obviously, when we're implementing the FIAP, we have our priorities, we have the goals that we have, or, we have certain areas that we're focusing on, we have a mandate. But just because that is the case doesn't mean that, you go in take Canada's guidebook and then throw those policies at them. Really, that localization piece all over again, that really becomes critical in all of this. Yeah, and then, sorry, just got interrupted. And then another piece I'll put into there is to be able, when you're trying to take power away from the people in power, or at least put in policies or change things in a way that might take away power, making it, showing the benefit, right, and is important, but also kind of that attitude shift that really needs to happen before you can have meaningful change. That's always a big struggle, like you said, Anne-Lise. One thing I found helpful, not just in international development, but even here, locally doing advocacy on SGBB type of stuff, is being able to show concrete benefit to the person or to the government or to the entity you're advocating to. So it's like, I'll say it's like talking to conservatives, let's say in this political environment, where, data is helpful. So for example, an initiative that we had about, mining, when they were able to show that actually safe mining practices would increase profits and, that they would be able to extract more gold ore, they'd be less waste, but it's also safer for women and children. I mean, women and children, even if it was a little bit of an afterthought, there was benefit there as well. So, that attitude change came with, but there was something else in it, some other reason to do it as well. So sometimes you have that perfect pairing. Sometimes it really is just about, needing to really show attitude changes. But the more hard numbers you can show, the more facts you can show, I think helps measurability of those initiatives, but also helps convince people that that's kind of the direction we need to go towards.
Just being mindful of time. Perhaps we'll do one question if someone has any. I'm keeping an eye on the chat a little bit. Go ahead, Angelina.
Okay, thank you, Biko, and thank for our two guest speakers. You guys talk lots of things I feel really interested in. And actually, my question is because I actually plan to go to law school in the near future. And I saw both of you are human rights lawyer or sexual assault here. And one thing, actually, my question is about two parts. The first part is about like as a lawyer, and sometimes you need to deal with the clients who are highly traumatized, and how can you make sure you protect yourself? That's the first part of my question. The second part, I'm not sure if it's okay to ask, because I know like as a human rights lawyer, the payment is not as that good as maybe a corporate lawyer or criminal lawyer. And I'm curious about what's the intention behind this to like keep going rather than the financial benefits or something. That's my two part of my question.
Okay, I can take a first stab. So the very first thing I will say is I am not actually a lawyer. I have studied law. I went to law school in Canada and then I did a master's of law. But I have not, and this is a very, it sounds like very nitpicky, but it's actually a big deal. So just to clarify that I'm not licensed to practice law in Canada. That being said, I think I can speak more broadly to through the course of my work, people that I'm interviewing, people on behalf of whom I'm advocating. And in that sense, I would say one of the most important things is to really develop a sense of the emotional requirements of your job, be very clear upfront and establish some boundaries for yourself from the get-go. And that doesn't mean that you have to be cold or unfeeling or that you have to shut off an emotional part of yourself. But I think it's very important that you treat it as a skill necessary for your job, because if you don't, then you get to the point where you are actually incapable of performing your job because of the like mental load and the emotional toll that's taking place. So I think it's actually something that I'm a bit passionate about, because I do think it's a component that we should be more mindful about teaching law students and legal professionals, is the emotional toll and sort of emotional component of the job. We talk about emotional labor, and I think in this context it's relevant or applicable. The second part of your question, the payment for human rights lawyers. I will say that most people who go to law school and incur a significant amount of debt because of how expensive legal training is. And so in that sense, there's a clear incentive that motivates law students who are very quickly out of law school to pursue a higher paying position at a higher paying firm in a higher paying legal field. But that doesn't mean that it's not feasible. As a Canadian working in this space, as a Canadian who's interested in human rights law, there are articling positions available that do focus either on human rights specifically or international law more broadly, that pay a living wage. And then I think it's the awareness that you're going into it not for the financial component of it, but really the like recognition that, and I think this is like how I came to the law, is the recognition that the law has an ability to completely shape a person's life and to either realize aspirations or to remove them, depending on how it's implemented, depending on how it's designed, and depending on that person's individual behavior. And I think when you recognize that you as a legal professional can have a transformative impact in ensuring that someone has access to justice, I think that's what really makes the difference for me, because you can't repair the harm that was suffered, and that's not your role as a lawyer. But what you can do is ensure that and one person in this has the best possible chance of accessing justice for the harm that was experienced. Obviously, like there's different areas of law that might not necessarily apply across the board, but I think if you're interested in human rights law, if you're interested in advocating for people who have experienced human rights violations, that component is crucial, because most of the time, at least most of the people that I've interacted with who have experienced some form of human rights violation are not necessarily seeking like monetary compensation, although some are. But most of them, ultimately, what they want is for justice to be served, for the harm to be recognized, for an apology. And, sometimes that apology or that recognition comes in the form of money, but sometimes it comes in the form of an apology. And I think that and a recognition or a change in policy. And I think that can be very, very powerful for someone who has experienced an injustice. So yeah, I'll leave there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel really inspiring, because the one thing I didn't share about is because I used to be a gender-based violence survivor. And back then, because I don't have any knowledge about laws, I didn't seek for any legal support. And that's something like really shaped my mindset. I really want to know the law one day so I can help other people. But I'm also struggling with the financial part, because at the end of the day, we still need to make our own living. And yeah, but your answer really inspired me. I think it gave me lots of fruit to think about. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I'm glad that my answer was helpful for you.
And if I can just add a comment, I like echo a lot of what Anne-Lise said, and Angelina, thanks for sharing as well. I think it's also important, like I didn't come from a legal background, I'm first gen in law. So I didn't know lawyers. What I knew was from TV and Googling, but even Googling, I didn't go down the rabbit holes. And I think this is in any profession. What you don't know. I think if you asked me before I went into law school, who are the human rights lawyers, right? Like I could name maybe one, but then but I don't think you need to be martyred to do public interest work, to do human rights work, to do any of that at all. And for two reasons. Number one, I'm kind of proof. I actually, if you ask most people, I'm a personal injury lawyer who does a lot of sex assault work, and I do a lot of other things that don't come with my day-to-day legal practice, like the work with Alinea. I'm a consultant for them. Lisa is a separate thing. So I'm doing a lot of things on the side. So one way to structure it is to have a good paying job, but then, take on pro bono projects if your firm allows, or do something outside of that kind of really fills that, what you need. And it might help with that self-care piece too. If you're working on something that's really close to, something that's really traumatic, something that's really important to you, being able to put that divide, not making it your 24/7 job, might actually be a smart thing to do in terms of managing. The other thing is that human rights is broad. The people who I know who are engaging with human rights on a day-to-day basis aren't always human rights lawyers, if they're quoting them. They're criminal defense lawyers, right? Like, they are employment lawyers. Think about all the human rights violations that are there, from gender-based discrimination, like honestly discrimination on any of the human rights grounds, right? You're working, so employment, family law lawyers working with very high trauma, high conflict situations, litigation lawyers. So there are a lot of spaces in which, even as a lawyer, you can do that work. It's just, I think it's going to be really important to talk to practitioners, to talk to folks, do your research, or really reach out to people, really broaden your concept of what it is, because you could be on Bay Street making a ton of money and still be doing meaningful human rights-based work. It's just about, thinking about those options as well. So you really don't have to be a martyr. You don't have to go into immense debt just to be able to do good in the world. It just takes a bit of creativity. So I wish you all the best. Like, there are a lot of opportunities out there for someone who cares.
Thank you, Anju. Sounds like if you want to make impact, you can be in any positions. And also I was inspired by you. Maybe I can choose my clients. It doesn't matter. I will advertise myself as a human rights lawyer, but we can always support people in any kind of lawyer position. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina, and thank you for sharing. I'm looking at the chat, and there's a lot of comments talking about how incredibly insightful and heartening the conversation would be, and I'd just like to echo that and thank the both of you for such a remarkable conversation. Just being mindful of time, I don't think we can do too many more questions, but it's been such a pleasure to sit here and have this space with you. I've learned so much. I take away an incredible amount of insight and expertise. One of the things that's really standing out is how inclusive governance is both a goal and an end, and I think that's come through really across the whole conversation, and I thank you both for creating a space for that. Before I pass the floor back to Bernice, I'd like to request the audience to answer this short poll, which will be launched now.